Lying in bed for an extra 30 minutes scrolling through your phone isn't self-care. It is the exact reason your nervous system is dying of exhaustion by 3 in the afternoon. And if you scroll past this, you will spend the next decade trying to cure a dopamine addiction you do not even have. You wake up, your eyes open, and before your feet touch the floor, your hand blindly reaches for the glowing screen. You tell yourself it is just 5 minutes to wake up, just a harmless habit. But neurobiology tells a much darker, much more violent story about what is really happening inside your chest before you force yourself into another brutal routine. We need to dissect the visceral truth. In the next few minutes, you will discover why your morning paralysis is actually a biological freeze response, how your relentless productivity is just a fragile mask for panic, and the exact stoic micro-habit you need to reclaim your baseline dopamine without declaring war on your own mind. In the past, Christopher was the golden child of his corporate world, a man whose calendar was a fortress of back-to-back meetings and strategic planning. He was the person colleagues relied on for every crisis, the manager who never said no, and the father who believed that providing for his family meant suppressing every flicker of his own fatigue. Every day felt like a well-oiled machine. His alarm would scream at 5 a.m., and before his feet hit the cold floor, his hand operating on a conditioned reflex that bypassed his conscious mind would grasp for the smartphone. He told himself it was just to check the schedule or scan the news, but in reality, his amygdala was already running a threat simulation, scanning emails for conflicts, for fires to put out, for any sign that the world he built was starting to crumble. This was his fake self-care. He wasn't relaxing, he was numbing. He was caught in a deep freeze response, a biological survival tactic where the brain, overwhelmed by the anticipation of the day's emotional demands, shuts down motor function to avoid the impending threat of human interaction. For 40 minutes, he would doom scroll, his thumb moving with a mechanical, jerky rhythm, his eyes glazing over as he consumed digital noise. It was a digital pacifier, a way to keep his nervous system in a state of suspended animation. Because to stop scrolling meant to face the suffocating silence of his own room. The silence that whispered he was exhausted, unfulfilled, and profoundly alone. He felt a heavy, leaden weight pressing down on his chest, not from a physical burden, but from the crushing recognition that he had become a stranger in his own life. Each swipe was an attempt to delay the moment when he had to put on his persona, the mask of the ever-smiling, ever-capable leader. He didn't know then that he wasn't lazy. He was a human system suffering from a chronic dopamine bankruptcy, forced to trade his internal peace for the approval of a world that didn't know he was screaming internally. He would finally drag himself to the bathroom mirror, but even there, he refused to hold his own gaze. He kept his eyes averted, brushing his teeth while staring at the cold tiles, terrified that if he really looked at the man in the mirror, the man with the hollow eyes and the clenched jaw, he would shatter. He convinced himself this was just being a professional. But inside, his nervous system was already screaming for a truce that he was too terrified to call. The tragedy of Christopher wasn't that he failed. The tragedy was that he was succeeding, and it was destroying him. He was a high-functioning sleepwalker, drifting through a life he no longer felt, unaware that the very routine he credited for his success was the cage that kept him from ever truly waking up. And the lock on that cage was about to be broken by a force he could no longer suppress. Until one morning, the finely tuned machine simply refused to reboot. It was exactly 5:45 when Christopher stood in his dimly lit bathroom, the blue light of his phone still casting a pale, sickly glow across the porcelain sink. He reached for the cold water, preparing to execute the daily ritual of washing away his exhaustion. But his body staged a violent, unexpected strike. His reflection caught his eye just for a fraction of a second, and instead of the usual numbness, a wave of profound, suffocating panic crashed over him. His heart began to hammer against his ribs with the brutal, erratic rhythm of a trapped animal. The air in the small room suddenly felt impossibly thick, refusing to fill his lungs. His fingers trembled so violently that the heavy glass bottle of expensive cologne slipped from his grip, shattering into 100 jagged pieces on the floor. He dropped to his knees, clutching his chest, gasping for a single clean breath, while the digital notifications continued to ping mercilessly from the counter above. This was not a heart attack. This was a nervous system completely collapsing under the weight of an absolute dopamine bankruptcy. For years, he had drained his brain's natural baseline of dopamine within the first 30 minutes of waking up, relying on cortisol and pure adrenaline to drag his hollow shell through the corporate battlefield. But today, the shadow self, the exiled, exhausted part of his psyche, had finally taken the wheel. As he kneeled there among the broken glass, staring at his shaking hands, a terrifying realization pierced through the fog of his panic. A cognitive slap that tore off his executive mask. He wasn't having a breakdown because of a looming deadline or a difficult client. He was breaking down because the face he briefly saw in the mirror wasn't the 42-year-old vice president. It was the biological echo of a terrified 10-year-old boy. The parentified child who used to wake up at dawn, tiptoeing around a volatile, unpredictable house, terrified of making a sound, desperate to fix everyone else's problems just to earn the right to exist in his own home. He had spent 3 decades meticulously building an empire of adult responsibilities, using productivity as a hyper-vigilant defense mechanism to prove he was useful, to prove he was safe. But the body keeps the score, and his nervous system could no longer tell the difference between a high-stakes board meeting and the childhood terror of an unsafe sanctuary. His relentless morning routine wasn't discipline at all. It was an elaborate, exhausting trauma response. And as the panic slowly began to recede, leaving him hollowed out on the cold bathroom floor, Christopher realized that picking up his phone to numb the pain again would be a fatal mistake. The illusion of his high-achieving life had shattered, just like the glass surrounding him, leaving him with a desperate, terrifying question. If he wasn't the tireless savior who sacrificed his own peace for everyone else, then who exactly was the man bleeding out on the tiles? And what would happen if he finally stopped running? Because of that violent collapse on the bathroom floor, Christopher could no longer hide behind his favorite defense mechanism. For years, he had deployed the ultimate shield to protect his ego, the excuse of adulthood responsibility. If you were to ask him why he grabbed his phone at 5 in the morning, his immediate defensive answer would always be the same. I have a team that depends on me, he would say. I have a mortgage to pay and a family to secure. I'm not running away from myself. I'm just being a responsible adult. But is that the biological truth? Is it really discipline when your heart rate spikes at the mere sound of a notification? Neurobiology violently disagrees. Let me ask you a brutally honest question. If your frantic morning routine is truly about responsibility, then why does the idea of sitting perfectly still for 5 minutes without your phone make your stomach twist in pure agony? The answer is a cognitive slap that shatters the high achiever's illusion. You're not rushing out of bed because you're dedicated. You're rushing because you're terrified of the silence. Christopher finally realized that his morning doomscrolling was not a moral failure or a lack of willpower. It was something far more profound. Carl Jung called it the shadow, and what Christopher experienced was the shadow's strike. His physical body, the vessel that held the terrified inner child he had ignored for decades, was actively rebelling against the tyranny of his social mask. His nervous system was so severely depleted from constantly simulating threats and maintaining the facade of the perfect provider that it literally forced a systemic shutdown. That paralysis you feel under the heavy blankets every morning, that inability to stop swiping through meaningless videos, it is not laziness. It is your body's desperate, final attempt to protect you from the psychological violence you inflict upon yourself the moment you step out of the bedroom. You think you're using digital dopamine as a reward, but your unconscious mind is using it as a surgical anesthetic to numb the visceral pain of self-abandonment. Christopher saw the terrifying reality of his existence. He was a high-functioning sleepwalker. He was successfully solving everyone else's emergencies while his own internal home was burning to the ground. Every time he used forced discipline to drag his exhausted body through another morning, he wasn't building mental toughness. He was just internalizing the abusive voice of his past that originally taught him his worth was only measured by his utility. The realization hit him with a crushing weight. The enemy was never his lack of motivation, but rather his absolute refusal to grant himself permission to simply exist without being useful. He had to stop trying to fix his broken routine with more productivity apps and start listening to the terrifying message his bodily paralysis was desperately trying to deliver. He had to finally look the monster of his own making directly in the eyes. Also, because of that profound realization, Christopher made a radical, counterintuitive decision. He completely abandoned the toxic illusion of iron discipline. He deleted the sight blocker apps, threw away the complex morning routine checklists, and stopped treating his nervous system like a disobedient soldier that needed to be whipped into shape. The very next morning, at exactly 5 a.m., when his eyes snapped open and that familiar, terrifying weight immediately crushed his chest, he did not blindly reach for the glowing screen on his nightstand. He did something infinitely more terrifying to a man addicted to productivity. He did absolutely nothing. He lay there in the cold, raw silence of his bedroom and allowed himself to truly feel the agonizing physical sensations of his own anxiety. This is the clinical practice of somatic tracking. A visceral, conscious surrender to the body's desperate warning signals. Instead of scrolling to numb the phantom threat, Christopher slowly placed his right hand over his hammering heart. He felt the sharp, acidic knot twisting violently in his stomach. He noticed how his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack his own teeth, a physical residue of holding back decades of unexpressed boundaries. And instead of judging himself or whispering those familiar abusive insults about being a lazy failure, he sent a deliberate micro-signal of profound safety directly to his panicked amygdala. He breathed in deeply, silently telling his fractured body, "I know you're terrified right now. I know you are remembering the chaotic mornings of our past, but we are safe in this room, and I swear I will not abandon you anymore." He consciously stepped into the burning fire of dopamine withdrawal, utilizing the brutal Stoic principle of amor fati. To love one's fate, to embrace this physical suffering not as a cruel punishment, but as the ultimate forge for true mental sovereignty. It was absolute torture at first. For 15 brutal, agonizing minutes, his brain practically screamed for the cheap digital anesthetic, his fingers twitching, begging for just one quick scroll to silence the ghosts of his trauma. But he held his ground. He sat there in the dark, watching the anxiety wash over his nervous system like a violent, freezing wave, observing it without trying to fix it, until, miraculously, the wave finally began to recede. By refusing the digital pacifier, Christopher stopped the daily neurological bankruptcy before it could even drain his energy. He was no longer using his precious social battery to fight a war against his own shadow. The crippling morning paralysis finally dissolved not because he forced himself to conquer it through sheer willpower or toxic positivity, but because he finally gave his inner child the one fundamental thing it had been begging for since he was 10 years old: the radical permission to simply sit still in a quiet room without ever having to earn the basic right to breathe. Ultimately, Christopher did not find his peace by downloading another habit tracker or forcing himself through a brutal cold shower. He found it by permanently firing his internal tyrant. And this is the exact profound truth you must face tomorrow morning when the alarm violently pulls you into the waking world. Your smartphone is not your actual enemy. It is merely the cheap digital anesthetic you use to avoid the terrifying silence of your own company. The real battle is not against your screen time. It is against the visceral terror of finally feeling the raw sensations of your own physical body. You do not need more military discipline to fix your broken mornings. You need to declare a radical ceasefire with your own shattered nervous system. You must stop treating your systemic exhaustion as a shameful moral failure and start treating it as a desperate biological cry from the exiled parts of you that were never allowed to simply rest. Tomorrow morning, when that familiar phantom anxiety grips your chest, I challenge you to do the hardest thing in the modern world. Do not reach for the glowing screen. Put your hand firmly over your hammering heart. Breathe deeply into the raw, uncomfortable silence, and actively grant yourself the absolute permission to exist without being immediately useful to anyone else. It is time to step out of the high-functioning sleepwalk and finally inhabit your own life. But perhaps, as you finally sit still in that quiet room, you will realize something even more unsettling. You will realize that this paralyzing fear of not being enough did not actually start with you. And the ruthless voice demanding your constant perfection sounds disturbingly like someone from your childhood. If you finally want to know how to sever the invisible emotional puppet strings of the people who originally installed this anxiety inside you, if you are ready to learn the brutal, liberating psychological art of radical detachment from the toxic parents who shattered your baseline, I will expose the truth in the next video. Please watch it. Because fully healing your present nervous system is biologically impossible until you actively choose to amputate the emotional poison of your past.